Today, we put the spotlight on the Web Summit that brings together a global community of founders, entrepreneurs, business leaders, and investors to connect and exchange ideas about the technology and trends shaping the world. Since 2009, Web Summit has gathered over 1 million attendees, and to talk to us about what's in store for this year and the Web Summit Qatar that is scheduled in February next year, I have with me its founder and CEO, Paddy Cosgrave. Paddy, welcome to Startup Street. Now, before we talk about the second edition of the Web Summit Qatar, tell us what Web Summit is all about, what made you start it, and what did you aim to achieve? What is the big play?
Great questions, and thanks for having me on. Web Summit is the largest technology conference in the world. It's the largest annual gathering of technology startups and technology investors. I started it what feels like a very long time ago from my bedroom in Dublin. It started as a 150-person gathering, and over the years, it's grown into something a lot bigger. And I started out with the intention of creating a fantastic startup conference in Ireland for the startup community, in particular around Dublin. And the particular approach that I took just seemed to resonate, and quite quickly, Web Summit grew from a very small regional startup conference into the largest startup conference in the world.
All right, the approach has resonated, and how? Talk to us about the kind of partnerships that you formed at Web Summit events over the years, from investment opportunities to perhaps the birth of new age companies. Give us some stories. Also, where does the Web Summit stand today in 2024?
Yeah, it's a great question. Over the years, some of the entrepreneurs that have attended and spoken, have included everyone from Elon Musk, of course, behind Tesla and SpaceX, to the founders of Uber, Instagram, and of course, many notable Indian founders as well. The founders of Snapdeal, Flipkart, the Bansal brothers, Ola, Policy Bazaar, just tons and tons of incredible Indian entrepreneurs who have traveled really from the other side of the world to meet with other entrepreneurs, other tech entrepreneurs, investors, and journalists. And out of that, of course, there's been lots of incredible stories. A long time ago, Uber closed their Series B round, really in a pub in Dublin. And since then, there's been hundreds of stories, and
yes,
you can just read about them online. But I often think it's unfair to focus on the big names. At the end of the day, Web Summit is an opportunity for very young companies, very early stage startups, to come together, to meet with each other, to meet potential customers, to meet with potential investors. And then it's probably the largest gathering of technology journalists in the world. And it's an opportunity for these young companies whose stories may not yet have been told anywhere, to share their story, to share their product, to share what they're hoping to build. And that, I think, is particularly exciting.
Absolutely.
It's exciting, of course, to meet and hear from some of the biggest names in the world. But oftentimes you sort of know their story. You know what they're building. They may provide an interesting insight, but I find personally the magic of Web Summit is discovering the next generation of companies that may become household names, or quite likely will become household names over the next 5 or 10 years. And so if you're into discovering the future, Web Summit provides a great window.
Absolutely. And we surely keep a track of that on Startup Street. You touched upon the kind of big tech partners you've onboarded, the key policymakers and icons that have partnered with you. But tell us, Paddy, how have you been able to scale so fast? What has been the secret sauce?
It's a great question. Our focus has always been on something that we call meaningful connections. So we try and increase the likelihood through building a lot of software that you'll come to the event and you'll meet a number of people that may be beneficial to your business. That doesn't mean there's any guarantee you're going to meet people that will transform your business. We just work hard to build software and design the environment that is Web Summit in such a way that you have maybe a higher likelihood of meeting people that may be of some value, some material benefit to your company. We focused on that as best we could initially in Europe. And then we did the very difficult thing of trying to start a conference somewhere else in the world. And unfortunately, there's a very big graveyard of conferences that try to repeat the magic that they've created in one place somewhere else. But we've been very fortunate that the formula that we seem to have that has worked in Europe quite clearly has started to work in other places around the world. So we've taken Web Summit now to several other cities in very geographically diverse parts of the world.
Absolutely.
First to North America, then we went to South America, Asia, and the Middle East. And so far it seems to just seems to resonate with people.
You know, picking up from what you just said, you are expanding Web Summit globally with a roster of events around the world. Why did you choose to host Web Summit Qatar in Doha, and what makes it stand out?
It's a great question. I think Qatar is, well, firstly, it's an incredible place. It's a gateway to the world, not just to the Middle East. Within 3-4 hours flying time, you can reach billions of people, not just in India, but elsewhere. It's got incredible flight connectivity. It's a proven record in hosting some of the world's most significant, largest, and most complex events. Of course, most recently, like the Football World Cup. I think, in particular, with regard to the Middle East, it's a market of 500 million people. There's rapid economic growth, so you can't ignore it. If you're in markets outside of the Middle East, likewise, you can't ignore it. If you're an ambitious entrepreneur, your company is ambitious, you probably want to have a foothold in that market.
Sure.
And for all those reasons, that made hosting the event in Qatar, I think, very attractive for us.
Okay. So tell us, Paddy, what should people expect from the Web Summit Qatar in February next year? This is the second edition. How is it bigger, better? Any key highlights you can share?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, firstly, it's by far and away the most geographically diverse event that we run anywhere in the world. Our event in Europe is, there are attendees from well over 100 countries, so all over the world, but participation is heavily skewed towards Europe and North America. Not so with Qatar. It's much more geographically diverse, including significant participation from India, not just in terms of speakers and media and investors, but a large number of startups as well, from all over India, from Bengaluru, of course, and New Delhi, but elsewhere as well. And I think with the flight connectivity, in particular because of Qatar Airways, it's just a very easy trip to make.
Okay.
And for me, I think that is one of the big advantages. And I also think for a lot of ambitious startups, especially growth stage startups, the sources of capital are diversifying. The traditional source of capital were quite, almost exclusively venture capital, some private equity. Increasingly, some of the most active players in the world in this space are sovereign wealth funds, the most active of which are in the Middle East, all of which will be at Web Summit in Qatar. So you're a fast-growing company, you're thinking of your next capital raise, your next funding round. One of the, a reasonable place to spend a day or 2 days is going to be Web Summit Qatar. And likewise, if you're one of the, one of the leading venture capital funds in India and you're thinking about raising your next fund as well, I think there's a high likelihood that, a few of your leading LPs, limited partners, those are the institutions or individuals that invest in venture capital funds.
Yes.
You're going to find some of the biggest ones in the world at Web Summit Qatar as well, because many of those are increasingly, they are some of the major sovereign wealth funds of the Middle East.
All right, let's also quickly talk about your flagship event held in Lisbon each November. I believe it hosts more than 70,000 attendees, and this time you're expecting more startups than ever before. If you could quickly elaborate on the upcoming Lisbon Web Summit, what should we be expecting there?
It's a great question. I think one of the most counterintuitive patterns that we're seeing, venture capital investment has declined hugely over the last number of years. It really reached a peak 21, 22, so that's 2021 and 2022. And the amount of new unicorns, or just the total amount of venture capital being deployed globally, was at unprecedented or historic heights. Over the last 2 years, the rate of venture capital investment has fallen spectacularly at a rate probably that is only matched with the dot-com collapse. So quite counterintuitively, what we're seeing is that the number of startups coming to Web Summit has increased sharply. There appears to be a decoupling, at least at the early stages, of startup creation between venture capital activity and startup activity.
Sure.
What does that mean? I think that means that, many entrepreneurs don't feel, or an increasing number of entrepreneurs no longer feel it's necessary to raise venture capital, at least to get a basic product launched.
Okay. Be it the Web Summit in Lisbon or your inaugural Web Summit Qatar that saw the largest and perhaps the most globally diverse cohort of startups to ever gather in the region, I believe there were more than 1,000 startups from 80 countries with 38% women founded. Paddy, I want to know, how did you manage that when the economy and funding is tightening for startups?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And, to host our very first event in Qatar earlier this year and to have over 1,000 startups, these are startups that are exhibiting. There are many other startup founders kind of simply attending. So these are startups that apply for a program, and applications were, pretty incredible. I think it underlines just how much kind of economic activity is now occurring outside of the West. I mean, it's a very obvious statement to make. You look at the underlying data. Neither North America or Europe are doing, economically at least, all that well compared to many other markets around the world. And the rest of the world, the ROW, it feels a lot more boomy. And we're seeing huge numbers of startups coming from those regions of the world. And a huge number of those startups are founded by women, which just wasn't the case 5-10 years ago.
Yes. So Paddy, are you now seeing signs of spring? Because what conversations are you having with venture capitalists and founders? We saw funding winter. Now are we into spring? I
don't know, because the data is still quite bleak. Obviously, there's huge amounts of money that have gone into AI startups, and that's been heavily concentrated in a small number of startups. So when you cut that out of the data, there's still a very stark downward trend. What we are seeing, at least, is an increasing number of bootstrap startups getting to what you might call product market fit.
Okay.
They've got revenue. They are able to sustain themselves on that revenue. And that was a kind of part of the market that was perhaps overshadowed for years and years by these startups that were raising huge amounts of money. And I think that's really interesting. I think many of those companies eventually will get to a point where they want to scale even more, and they will need to access growth stage capital. But right now, I'm not massively bullish on the venture capital industry.
All right, so you're not massively bullish, but let's talk about your next Web Summit in May 2025. You're launching a new North American flagship event, Web Summit Vancouver. Tell us how the new event will continue the company's mission to support and connect the global technology ecosystem.
Yeah, it's a great question. Vancouver's a beautiful city. It also has a lot of connectivity into Asia. So when we build these events, we choose cities that have large amounts of connectivity, flight connectivity around the world, that allows them to be much more global. We think it's an imperative, of course, to do something in North America. We've been on the East Coast in Toronto for the last 5 years. Now we're moving to the West Coast, which, historically, I think has been it's the more famous side for tech in the United States, not to take away from all the recent activity on the East Coast. And a bit of history in Boston, but nothing compared to Silicon Valley and the West Coast more broadly, stretching up to Seattle and to Vancouver as well. So we're very excited. We're excited to be in Vancouver. It's in particular got a rich history of gaming, and we're looking forward to integrating gaming really for the first time in our conferences.
Well, Paddy, on that note, it's time for me to head into a short break, but don't go anywhere as we continue our chat with Paddy Cosgrave on the other side. Stay tuned. Welcome back. I'm in conversation with Paddy Cosgrave, the founder and CEO of Web Summit. Paddy, let me now talk to you about the tech sector globally. Any trends in the sector that have caught your attention? If you could share with us some of the tech offerings from tech startups that excite you.
Great question. Obviously, in the AI space, it's very difficult to ignore it. There's a huge amount happening. I'm quite captivated by it. But I'm also very captivated when I think of startups. Sometimes I think of hardware plays, and sometimes I think of cars. And when I watch what's happening in electric vehicles, in particular coming out of China, it's just, you look at the charts, you look at the explosion in exports of Chinese cars. And to me, that's the biggest tech mega trend in the world, whether it's BYD, NIO, or any number of other Chinese car companies. It's just one of the most stunning technological shifts in history, and it's so difficult to ignore. The implications, I don't really know, but I'm not an expert in the field, but you just can't ignore it. It's incredible.
Absolutely. And what kind of growth and maturity are you seeing in Indian tech startups now?
Well, I mean, the first thing that you can't ignore is that most of the world's major tech companies are run by Indians. So that's quite something. And it speaks to many things. It speaks to, when it comes to education and the IITs, they're amongst, the greatest institutes of education, of higher learning in the world. And when you think, I think what's interesting is looking at the pattern or the flow of talent. That for a very long time, many of the brightest minds, or most of the brightest technical minds in India left, and they moved for the most part to the United States, in particular, of course, to the West Coast, built some tremendous companies, already touched on the fact that many of them are leading some of the most important technology companies in the world. But now you begin to see two things occur. One, I think the volume of supreme talent leaving India for the West Coast of the United States has declined. And the number of Indians, I mean, you read great stories all the time, deciding, you know what, we're leaving California, I'm leaving California, I'm moving back to Bengaluru or somewhere else. That's increasing as well.
Yes.
And I think that has a long-term compounding effect on the success of tech companies coming out of India. So the future is bright. At the end of the day, you need brain power to build great companies.
Absolutely.
Tremendous brain power coming out of India. And thankfully now less of it is leaving India and more of it is also coming back to India.
All right. So what differences, Paddy, do you see? And what do you think Europe can learn from India and Asia in general when it comes to tech adoption and advancements?
Well, I think it's been happening for almost a decade now that Western tech companies are doing teardowns of Indian and Chinese tech companies. What does a teardown mean? They're looking at all the little features and iterations and evolutions of Indian tech products, whether it's Flipkart or a number of other products, to try and figure out what they should be doing in California. You take Facebook Messenger. I'm pretty sure Facebook Messenger was trying to aid some of the kind of super apps that were coming out of Asia over the last half decade. And more. In fact, there are lots of stories about that. So, I think it's a two-way street, and that's a great thing. For a long time, it was perhaps, a one-way street with talent and technology. And I'm guessing now it's a two-way street. There's lots that the United States can learn.
Sure. Paddy, what advice do you have for Indian startups looking to make a mark on the international stage? What are the must-haves in their global playbook?
Well, I'd first say just keep doing what you're doing, because there's a tremendous amount of incredibly successful Indian tech entrepreneurs and investors already based all over the world. But I guess, if you're starting out, and this can seem a little bit repetitive, India is a huge market. It's the most populous country in the world, and you can build an incredibly successful, scaled company just inside of India. But I think in the early days, you should give yourself every opportunity to get out there and decide, is India going to be your sole focus? Is it going to be your dominant focus, or is it going to be one of your markets that you focus on? There's opportunity everywhere in the world.
Sure.
And it's very easy, whether you go to Web Summit or a number of other tech conferences. I think they provide stellar opportunities to go and meet other founders who may be building somewhat similar products in other markets and learning from them.
Thank you so much for being so candid and for your valuable insights. Thank you so much for joining us.